Happy Boxing Day, everybody, and Tony here with a review of Mozart's Trollflöten, known in its original German as the Zauberflöte and in English as the Magic Flute, which I saw at the Kungliga Operan, and this was also performed in Swedish with a translation done by Ulf Peter Hallberg. The conductor was Eva Ollikainen. The production and sets were done by Ole Anders Tandberg. The costumes were done by Maria Geba. The lights were handled by Ellen Rouge. The choreographer was Anna Koch, and the dramaturgy was handled by Katarina Aronsson. I was mainly interested in this production because Kerstin Avema, who was also a singer I not only admire, but whose career I've actually followed for quite some time, sang the role of the Queen of the Night. I'll get to her later, but first, my thoughts on the production. The overture starts off, and we see that the entire action seems to be set within a classroom, with Pamina entering in, and it seemed as though that as the overture is about to end, she's almost about to be mugged by the other kids. I use that term loosely because they're actually adults dressing up to be teenagers and young adults. And after the overture ends, we then head into the first act where we see Tamino sitting in one of the seats, and he is constantly being pestered by a small snake, and it's up to the three ladies to save him, and they throw the small snake away while at the same time admiring Tamino. We also get introduced to Papageno, who's even trying out different bird calls, and he even tries out some duck quacks with certain devices until he finds his signature pan flutes, which I thought was quite hilarious. And instead of having a padlock in his mouth, he is then smashed with an eggshell, thus rendering him speechless, and instead of his after the Queen of the Night's first aria, he doesn't really say anything, and it's basically up to the trombone to basically say his hms. And speaking of the Queen of the Night's first aria, we're even treated to not only the Queen, but also a set of sleeping people who I presume are like in a sleeping death type of position. And while the Queen is singing, we're kind of left to wonder that this is basically her realm of the sleeping death, so to say. And what's so interesting is that every time Monostatos is on stage, there seems to be this red light that is following him to basically heighten his lust. And instead of having Papagena's old lady disguise, Papagena is basically seen under the wings, I should know because I also sat in one of the topmost seats, and she's having a little conversation with him. And also there were a lot of dancing bears every time Tamino plays his flute or Papageno plays his mini piano, which is actually supposed to be a glockenspiel. And even though I would have loved to have a lot more variety, especially when it comes to having a lot more woodland creatures, like we could have had some foxes, rabbits, owls, and maybe even some mountain lions in the mix, it would have been a lot more interesting than just having bears. But I thought that the dancing and singing bears scenes were actually really, really cute. So overall, the production was pretty cute in its own special way. It's not the best thing I've ever seen, nor is it the worst thing I've ever seen. It's just cute. It is quite fun to watch, and it also helps that there's a little bit of fourth wall breaking done by the characters when they're communicating with the conductor of the evening, Maestra Eva Ollikainen, which was really fun. And there were also some moments where some musical numbers did get rearranged, like instead of having Soll ich dich teuren nicht mehr sehen, the trio between Pamina, Tamino, and Sarastro, in like the climax, it was then moved to like the beginning of the second act, which I found rather interesting. And the whole old lady interaction scene was pretty much out. It was basically replaced in favor of Papageno communicating with the bears. So yes, there may have been some changes in the overall scenario, but it was still a very fun experience from beginning to end. And now we get to the singers, starting off with our main hero, Tamino, who was sung with ardent fervor by the superb Swedish lyric tenor Joel Anmo, and he was a very superb musician, and he was quite boyishly handsome on stage. His voice was well woven with perfectly spun notes, and he showed no signs of tiring whatsoever. He not only had a very beautiful lyric tenor voice, but he had endurance to really match his overall skill, making him very versatile as a performer. Elisabeth Maya was a very gorgeous Pamina, both vocally and theatrically. It also helps that she's quite young and pretty on stage. And even though there are moments where she does tend to be quite shrill in her top notes, she still manages to back everything up with superb acting and a very lovely stage presence. Jens Persson was an absolute riot as Papageno. He not only had a sturdy lyric baritone voice, but he also has great comic timing. He was especially vivacious on stage, bouncing all around the stage, delivering his lines to the best of his abilities, and he was just having a ball as Papageno, and he certainly has a very bright future. The same thing I could say for the singers who sang Tamino and Pamina. And Viviana Holmberg was an absolute charm as Papagena. She had a light and breezy voice, and she was just an absolute darling on stage. So when it comes to the two lovers, Tamino and Pamina, sung lovingly by Joel Anmo and Elisabeth Maya, and Papageno and Papagena, sung with such lovable charm by Jens Persson and Viviana Holmberg. They were absolutely phenomenal artists with great futures ahead of them. But what about Kerstin Avemo as the Queen of the Night? Well, she was a really great actress, and I really loved the sound of her voice. But there were times that she was struggling in the highest notes, and there were times that her high Fs were almost non-existent. And the first high F that she tried to attempt in O Zitre nicht almost sounded really non-existent, and she basically emitted something akin to like a high C or a high D, and her high Fs in Der Hölle Rache were mere squeaks. But that's not to say that she was a bad singer, no. Keep in mind that I have been following this particular singer for quite some time, ever since I saw lots of YouTube clips of her as Gilda, Lucia, and Blonde, and even her rendition of Olympia's Doll Song and Adele's Laughing Song, just to name a few. She's also a singer whose repertoire is quite vast, from singing lyric coloratura roles like Gilda and Blonde to the slightly more dramatic coloratura roles of Lucia and Violetta, to pure lyric soprano roles like Melisande. There's no doubt that she is a very versatile singing actress, but I'm sure that that repertoire certainly took a toll on her voice, especially when she sang the role of the Queen of the Night. And for someone who has really high expectations for the Queen of the Night, I certainly felt that Madame Avemo didn't really live up to some of them. But I have to give her credit for her superb acting skills. She was a marvelous actress on stage, even though some of her vocal resources were kind of few and far in between. But despite some of her vocal shortcomings, especially in a lot of her top notes, she still has a very superb stage presence, and she was really gorgeous in that black dress. And personally, I long for a true dramatic coloratura soprano akin to Christina Dortekom and Edda Moza singing this type of role. Nowadays, we have the likes of Clara Kolonitz, who seems to do wonderfully with that role, and I could have wanted her to sing this role in particular. But despite the vocal shortcomings that are found here and there, especially considering that there were moments where Madame Avemo's voice did tend to be a little bit stringent and a little bit on the shrill side, I still have to give Madame Avemo loads of credit for her superb acting skills, whether it be the anguish that she experiences in O Titre Nicht, or that Lady Macbeth-like ambition that she has in Der Hölle Rache, or her single-minded nature in the final scene, Nur stille Stille. You definitely have to give Madame Avemo credit for everything she had to pull off theatrically. Jan Erik Elleby was a very superb Zarastro. There were also moments where he even sang some interpolated low notes, whether it be in the closing scene of the first act, and even one in Diesen Heiligen Halle, where he even emitted a low E, which I found really interesting. And I'm sure that what he emitted in the final scene of the first act was a low C. And it also helps that he had a very handsome stage presence. And speaking of Zarastro and a lot of his priests, they were basically made to look like the head ranger for Zarastro's case, and a lot of the other forest rangers, which I found really interesting. But in terms of Jan Erik Elleby's interpretation of Zarastro, it is still so sterling all throughout, with plush basso profondo notes and a very handsome muscular stage presence that pretty much swept me off the edge of my seat. Karl-Magnus Fredriksson's speaker was stentorian and fine all throughout. And it also helps that he also squeezed in a little bit of humor, not to make him too overly serious, thus making him a very fine singing actor, using his great and grand dramatic baritone voice to make this character quite authoritative. Niklas Björling's Rigats Monostatos was handsomely sung with his signature character tenor voice, and he was in tip-top shape all throughout. There are times that he made Monostatos quite a baddie, but he also made him the type of person who just wants to make sure that he pleases his master Zarastro. The three ladies were absolutely superb, from the full lyric soprano voice of Sigrid Vetlesta Bøe, the high mezzo voice of Monica Marström Skog, and the mezzo voice of Marie-Louise Granström. These three ladies were absolutely superb, and their voices blended like a trio of seraphims. The priest, who was sung by Anders Blom, had a very fine voice all throughout, and he was also quite humorous in this role, yet also maintains that sense of authority. The Two Armed Men, sung by Jon Nilsson and Alar Pintsar, were quite decent with fine voices. From Jon Nilsson's lyric tenor voice and Alar Pintsar's bass baritone voice, their voices blended quite well, though kinda lacking in gravitas. The three boys, sung by David Weissglas, Clara Leoson, and Vilma Kvamme, were pretty solid, but almost quite inaudible. But they still managed to have cherubic voices, even though the volume of their voice was almost quite inaudible. So overall, there were some shortcomings in the singing found here and there, but you really have to give credit to all the singers for being such fine actors on the stage. And the conducting done by Maestra Eva Ollikainen was really superb all throughout, and the chorus definitely had a ball from beginning to end. The same thing I can say about all the extras on stage. So overall, there may have been shortcomings here and there in terms of some of the singing, but you really have to give all the singers loads of credit for being quite committed to their craft and for really being such good stage actors. And Maestra Eva Ollikainen led the orchestra and chorus and the singers with such fine capabilities. And of course, it was backed up by a really cute production. Well, that's all for now. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for my review of Umberto Giordano's Fedora, also at the Kungliga Operan. So until then, good night everybody, and I hope you all have a great Boxing Day.